Hello, I'm Richard Walker. The Scottish Government's Continuity Bill had its third and final reading at Holyrood on Wednesday. The bill enshrines in Scottish law control over devolved powers which currently resides at Europe. It will only come into effect if Westminster continues with Brexit without the consent of the Scottish Parliament. Broadcasting Scotland went to Holyrood on Wednesday morning to discuss the bill with key players, including Michael Ruskell, the Scottish Government's Brexit Minister, Joan McAlpine, the convener of Holyrood's Europe Committee, Mark Ruskell of the Green Party, and Neil Findlay, the Labour Party's shadow Brexit Minister.
Joan McAlpine, you're convener of the Holyrood Committee, which deals with Europe, and indeed right now fisheries has emerged as one of the most controversial elements of the plans to leave Europe. Did that come as a surprise to you, and what is at the heart of that row?
Well, it didn't come as a surprise to me because right from the start of this process, the European Union has been very clear what its negotiating position is, and it's said to the UK if it wants a transition deal, it has to be a standstill transition deal, so everything has to remain the same for that transition period, and that would include being part of the common fisheries policy. Now, the way that has been reported in the UK media suggests that there's some kind of negotiation and that there's room for manoeuvre, and you'll see that basically the UK government has basically caved into everything that the European Union has asked for. And that would, so they've always known that this has been the case, but they, as in many other areas, they've given the impression that they have some kind of negotiating clout, and they don't. And I think it's really irresponsible that they have misled people in the fishing community, suggesting that from March next year they would be out the common fisheries policy when that was never their intention. And I think going forward we're not going to see a good deal for fisheries in the eventual deal between the European Union and the UK, because it's been alluded to in a number of speeches by Mrs May and others that the fisheries, the fishing waters around Scotland are part of the negotiating position, and they'll be part of a trade-off. So I think this is just the start. I mean, I know that the fishing community are really upset, and understandably so, at the broken promises over the transition period, but it's not going to get any better. I think what some people are trying to put a spin on it and saying at the end of the transition period there'll be a better deal. I don't think so. I think they're going to be sold out again.
What does this tell us about the strength of the negotiating position of the Westminster government?
Basically, the Westminster government has never had a strong position. I mean, they're basically trying to get a deal with the European Union that is as good as they have at the moment as a member of the single market. They've been out with the single market, and the European Union from the very beginning have said, no, sorry, if you're out of the single market, you're a third country, you get a third country trade deal, perhaps a bit like Canada. The UK government have never accepted that, and I think that a lot of the messages that have gone out to people in throughout the UK to suggest that they're going to get a better deal has been very misleading. The EU have been quite clear from the beginning that you can't pick and choose. You're either in the single market or you're outside the single market. There's no halfway house.
Today is a big day at Holyrood where we start the third stage of the Continuity Bill consideration. Where do you think we will be at the end of this deliberation?
I think Scotland will have asserted the sovereignty of its Parliament and will have protected Donald Dure's devolution settlement. This bill at the UK level is the greatest attack on devolution that there's ever been since the referendum, when 74% of people in Scotland voted for this Parliament with these powers, and the UK government's coming in and trying to destroy that. But something that 74% of people voted for, and I think tonight we're going to see our Parliament, on the side of the people of Scotland, speaking with a united voice, with the exception of the Tories.
Why do you think that is? In terms of why do you think the Tory party are reluctant to get involved with that, given that they have expressed support for devolution?
Well, it's interesting, isn't it? Because the Tory party, when this place was set up, they actually campaigned against it. If you remember back in that devolution referendum, they were resoundingly defeated and embarrassed. And it was often said that actually in this parliament was quite good for them, because the proportional representation system that they opposed actually allowed them to have a presence in here, and they did a good job of arguing in favour of devolution, said that they were very sorry. They spent years saying they were very sorry for opposing devolution. What this has exposed is perhaps, you know, like at their core, they were never bought into the project. And there are certainly elements within the UK Conservative Party that don't understand devolution and that are hostile to devolution, and they just don't understand that settlement, the Scotland Act, you know, like gave us powers in certain areas which people believed would be permanent, and clearly they're not.
There are 24 powers which are currently disputed. I suppose that if this agreement can't be reached on this, it's bound for the Supreme Court. What could happen there?
Well, I wouldn't want to second guess the Supreme Court. What I would say about the 24 powers you mentioned is that it's not just those 24 powers. Basically, the EU Withdrawal Act gives the UK government to take any power that they believe is in dispute and add it to those 24 powers. So they could take any devolved power that they felt intersected with the whole European Brexit legislation and say, no, we're taking that back. So it's actually really wide-ranging. And then, of course, there's also the powers that they published, which they decided were reserved powers, which nobody had even considered reserved powers before. State aid, for example, that's of great concern, because the Scottish Government has taken measures in the past to help companies and save jobs. I mean, a good example is the steel industry. A couple of years ago, the Scottish Government came in and helped save Scottish steel, and the English side of the steel industry didn't get the same support because it's a different ideology operating at the UK level. Now, if the UK put in state aid rules for the whole of the UK, you could find quite situations where the Scottish Government wanted to step in and save jobs, and the UK Government was saying, no, that doesn't suit our framework, and we're not having that. And that's of great concern to me, and I think it'll be of great concern to other people. There's also concerns around procurement. At the moment, we had a debate in procurement. That's basically, you know, like public contracts and how you award public contracts. So we had a debate in Parliament last week. Scotland's the only country within the UK that has certain rules around public contracts, that you need to have certain paying conditions for your workers, and there's lots of community benefit clauses, and we've gone as far as we can to try to make sure that public contracts aren't just based on the lowest price, that it's based on public good as well. That doesn't apply in other parts of the UK. So if the UK put a framework together around public procurement, it could completely undermine the good work that this Parliament has done in that area. And I think, you know, this isn't just about agriculture and fishing, as important as those are. It affects areas of life all over Scotland, people's jobs, people's livelihoods, everywhere.
Can you tell me what the Green Party were wanting to achieve in this whole process of looking at the continuity bill?
Well, we wanted to make sure that the bill in Scotland learnt from some of the lessons of the UK bill, and in particular we wanted to see that some of the key provisions within European law that have protected our environment, that have protected animal welfare, get saved and built on in the legislation in Scotland, and also that there was an opportunity with the continuity bill going forward for Parliament to have its say, to ensure that there's adequate democratic scrutiny of how laws get built on after withdrawal. So on these issues, we've had a very constructive discussion with government and other parties, and I think we've made real progress in saving these key protections and progress that we've had through the European Union into our law in Scotland.
There's been significant discussion on this. I think the stage 2, 11-hour discussion on it. So do you feel that there's been adequate potential or opportunity to discuss in detail the decision that you have to make?
I mean, it's been a very rushed process and not an ideal process at all. But I understand the reasons for that. It's had to go through as an emergency bill because of the failure of the UK government to adequately sit down with the devolved administrations and thrash out a deal. So it's been necessary that Scottish government's had to bring forward a bill like this. I mean, I think it's raised the bar a bit. I mean, there's had to be a kind of new level of political maturity amongst all of the parties, perhaps bar the Conservatives in the Scottish Parliament, to actually sit down and really thrash out what we're trying to get out of this bill. And to give the government their credit, you know, Michael Russell's been, you know, keen to sit down with us and really work out where our concerns are coming from and try and accommodate that. So, you know, I think what we're going to have at the end of this process is a bill which Parliament has actually influenced. It's not just a government bill, it's a bill that we can all share on.
What have been the key amendments that the Green Party has been pressing for?
So I think for me personally, I've been pushing forward key amendments which save some of the environmental principles, animal welfare principles, into legislation. So we're talking about principles like animal sentience, which means that we have to consider the welfare of animals when we're designing policy on trade or industrial policy or where animals can be used. Also principles like precautionary principle, which has meant that we haven't had GM crops being grown in Scotland because we're unsure what the environmental impacts have been. Polluter pays, which is, you know, something we all take for granted, but it actually comes from European law, and it ensures that corporations can't pollute our environment without taking full responsibility for the costs of that. And we've seen how that principle has been used in relation to open cast coal in Scotland, where companies have tried to walk away from the damage they've caused and they've been dragged back and had to pay. So, you know, there's been a lot at stake, I think, on the environment and animal welfare principles, and we've been struggling a bit to find a way to incorporate that into the continuity bill to make sure that these principles form a strong foundation of how we go forward rather than just getting left off.
In terms of the political consensus in Holyrood, which has been achieved remarkably, some might say, with one notable exception. First of all, in terms of the cooperation of the Greens and the Labour Party and Lib Dems, did that surprise you that that all those parties were willing to work together on this issue?
Well, you know, in this session of Holyrood, we've got a minority government. You know, it's a parliament of minorities. First Minister's emphasised that. So there has to be debate. There has to be a shifting of positions and negotiation on many issues. And I think, you know, with the recent Scottish budget, we've seen that between ourselves and the SNP. But I think it's one of the first times I've experienced in this session of Parliament of where all the parties, apart from the Tories, have actually come together to actually get into negotiation and agreement around an issue of critical importance. But I mean, it does show where we actually share a lot of the values, and environmental protection is one of those areas where, you know, we all value it. We may have discussions about how we move forward on those issues, but it's been an area where it's been, you know, productive, and we've been able to get a consensus on how we retain some of those key protections going forward.
Because one of the problems with Brexit is it's long, it's very involved, it's about detail and process, but it's also about emotional reactions of people. Is the animal rights issue one of those issues that you find that people react to emotionally rather than in terms of maybe more emotionally than intellectually even?
Well, I think it's a combination of an emotional and an intellectual response, which is hugely important. I mean, you know, we judge societies by how they treat the most vulnerable members of our societies, and animals are the most, you know, some of the most vulnerable members. So, you know, I think it's right that there was a great public debate around the time that Westminster refused to put the animal sentience provision into the UK bill. There was great concern about that, and I think, you know, the Scottish Government's learned from that. We've had a discussion here about how we save those types of principles going forward. And, you know, you shouldn't forget as well that the whole debate around animal sentience started with live exports in the 1990s. It was actually the UK government that was working within the European Union to ensure that animals aren't just treated as simple commodities that can be shipped around, but they're actually living beings that can feel pain and emotion and have their own needs. So, you know, that European progress that the UK was part and parcel of delivering in the 90s and early noughties, you know, shouldn't now be ditched. It should be saved going forward. And I think, you know, people reacted very strongly to that because, you know, they recognise the importance of animals, the importance of protecting the most vulnerable.
Is it difficult to, on the one hand, be against Brexit, the principle of it, but on the other hand find yourself negotiating the detail of it, and therefore I suppose you're trying to minimise something that you don't agree with in principle anyway?
Yeah, it's ironic in many ways. I mean, you know, it looks like we might be leaving the European Union. We probably will be leaving the European Union, but it's important that we don't leave the environment behind. And I think, you know, for us it's about trying to track what the European Union is doing, the progress that our partners and other countries in Europe are working towards, and making sure that, you know, we can continue to be part of that debate after withdrawal. I think that's going to be very hard because just having institutional mechanisms to share policy and influence policy won't be there anymore. But I think, you know, we need to keep pace with Europe and be part of that discussion about how we make progress across the continent. And, you know, ultimately I'd like to believe that Brexit could be stopped, or we can at least think again on the eventual deal with the potential to rejoin at some point, or be part of some kind of aligned arrangement such as the European Economic Area. But, you know, we need to keep that conversation, keep that link with progressive partners across Europe in place so that we can work together.
For your party, what's the red line issues in terms of Brexit, things that you just wouldn't countenance? Is it the single market, is it fisheries, is it agriculture? What are the issues that you just think, right, this far and no further?
Well, I think we've yet to see how the common frameworks are going to pan out, and, you know, we've got some big debates to come, particularly over fisheries, where perhaps there is more of an agreement between the Scottish Government and the UK Government about the type of fisheries policy that they want, which probably differs from what we would want. So there's a lot still to discuss, but, you know, I believe that we should still be making the case to be as closely integrated into Europe as we can be, and to be able to put that option to the people for democratic discussion and debate. And, you know, Green parties came together just a week ago in Guruk, Green parties from across these islands, to pledge to continue to work together to make the case for Europe and to make the case for a re-entry into Europe if that's what it takes. So, you know, we're not going away on this issue. We're going to continue to argue that we should be as closely aligned to Europe as possible, if not part of the European Union.
What is it about Europe, for your party, what is it about Europe that is something that needs fought for, something that needs argued for, that is worth all the effort that's going into saving our membership of it?
Yeah. I mean, if you look back at history, I mean, the European project over 70 years has been, you know, the biggest, most successful peace project we've ever had in the world. It's brought countries together. It's enabled citizens' movements to unite around, you know, progressive values, around human rights, around the need for universal health care, social security, around the environment. It's been an incredible project. It's not been without its flaws, and there have been issues about democratic involvement in policy making across Europe. But I believe it's something that we should be retaining and building on rather than exiting at this point. And that shared collective values that we have across Europe are hugely important. And, you know, as part of a green political movement, I've enjoyed working for the last 25 years personally with colleagues in Germany and Finland and Ireland and other countries where Greens have been integral to the European project, and I think have been you know, important voices in actually driving a lot of the progress that the European Union has achieved. So for me, I'm never going to stop being European, and always going to be working hard to make sure that we're part of the continuing progress that Europe can deliver.
Where do you stand on the current fisheries debate? I mean, there seems to be two elements to the controversy. One, that the fishing industry feels it's been lied to, but second, this principle of should it be in or out of the common fisheries policy? Do you think it should be in or out?
Well, if we didn't have a common fisheries policy in Europe, we would need to come up with one. I mean, you simply can't manage fisheries and manage the health of our seas in isolation. You need to have some kind of common framework. So whichever way you cut it, you need to have that in place. I think the promises that have been made by politicians over access to fishing grounds are being dishonest, because at the end of the day this isn't just about catching fish, it's also about selling fish as well. So 80% of the fisheries products that we harvest in Scotland, langoustines and hake and a whole range of products, get sold in Europe. It's Europeans who want to eat the fish that we catch. Very often the fish that we want to eat come from Greenland and Iceland and elsewhere, cod and other species. So the whole issue about access to fishing grounds and access to market are deeply entwined, and you can't have an agreement with the European Union on access to fishing if you don't have an agreement on access to market. I think this is the bit where politicians have been a little bit dishonest in suggesting that you can have unlimited access to all the fishing grounds, because at the end of the day you need tariff-free access to the market to actually sell your product to consumers who actually want to eat it in Europe. So, you know, this can only be done in a collective international agreement, and that's the way forward that we need to see.
In terms of the continuity bill that is going to be discussed and hopefully approved today, is there a danger that the discussion, which comes down to, I think now 24, or some people say 25 powers, and that's okay, I guess, but it's not massively inspirational, that people kind of miss the wider principle of what devolution means and how devolution would be undermined by the current Westminster plans?
I mean, I think what we need to see is a much more mature working relationship between Westminster and Holyrood. Whether we're going to get that or not, I don't know. I mean, I think there's continuing uncertainty around which powers are going to be reserved going forward. You know, the Westminster government has set out areas where they believe a common framework is required across the UK. That might require legislation, it might not, but all this is a movable feast, and it could be that several months down the line UK government says, well, actually we would prefer to be leading on a common framework on another area of policy, and we'll sideline Holyrood on that. So there's still a lot, I think, to discuss. But, you know, there needs to be an agenda of respect on both sides, and understanding that, you know, Holyrood Scottish Parliament now is a powerful legislature. It's got detailed experience on a whole range of areas, including environment, where, you know, we share responsibilities across the UK, and we should be having an equal say, and you know, picking up a lot of the work on the development of environmental approaches and legislation.
Would that argument be easier made with support from the Tory MSPs?
Well, I think they've yet to enter into this mature political environment that we're in. I mean, I think what we've seen is, you know, wrecking amendments coming from Tory MSPs over the last couple of weeks in committee, just spinning out the time, not really adding anything to the debate. And I think that's a shame, because, you know, there are some areas where we do agree, and I think, you know, some of the announcements that Michael Gove has made around environmental courts, around how we govern and protect the environment post-Brexit, have been progressive, but we've yet to see an involvement and engagement from Tory MSPs here on that debate. They could be joining the consensus on areas where we agree, and, you know, I'd be happy to have that discussion, but we've not seen it throughout the last couple of weeks. And I think, you know, for all the rhetoric of Ruth Davidson on the environment, you know, it's a shame that we don't actually see that translating into constructive dialogue and constructive suggestions for amendments as part of this bill.
What is it about the continuity bill that has sparked this consensus among Scottish political parties?
Well, there has been there's quite a lot of consensus in this Parliament regularly. I mean, people maybe don't appreciate that. Actually, politicians agree more than they disagree. Might be a controversial thing to say, but it's actually the reality. But I think the issue around the devolution of powers, I mean, for the Labour Party, we were the party that saw the process of devolution coming through, creation of the Parliament. We're very proud of that, and we will always defend the devolution, and certainly we will defend it against any attacks on devolution. I think the way in which the Tories have handled this process has been dreadful. I think they promised, David Mundell promised to resolve the situation in relation to the devolved powers in the House of Commons, and he ratted on that deal. And we now are in a situation where it looks like, we hope there's going to be a deal in the House of Lords. Now that's completely unsatisfactory. We would have wanted it resolved in the House of Commons. Leslie Laird, the Shadow Scottish Secretary, put down amendments to the EU withdrawal bill to resolve these issues, and the Tories were whipped to march through the lobbies to oppose it. And they have found themselves in this mess, and it's been a mess of their creation.
Is the argument for the Labour Party, is it more about the principle of protecting devolution, or is it about any of the powers, the 24 or 25 powers, specifically that you object to Westminster trying to keep hold?
I think the principle's important, that these powers should be devolved here. That was our understanding that they would be. We were told they would be. Therefore, I think that's the important part. We can get into detailed discussion about all the different aspects of how each of the powers work, but there is a principle at stake here that these powers, we were told they would be devolved, and they should be. Now, that does not mean that we shouldn't create common frameworks across the UK, because that's just sensible, it's common sense. People talk about common frameworks, I like to talk about common sense frameworks, because there are areas where we should have common frameworks across the UK.
If the Scottish Parliament is unsuccessful in persuading Westminster to compromise on this, what would you see as the next move?
Well, I think probably we'll see this going to the courts, and but I would hope that would be avoided. I hope this bill is unnecessary. Discussions with the Scottish Government, and Mike Ruskell has said this publicly, that if there can be a deal done in this, then the bill would be repealed. There are questions about that, because some of the issues that have been introduced over and above the bill, and things like health, the environment, animal rights, and the like, still sit there, even though they wouldn't be within the EU withdrawal bill. So we need to hear from the Scottish Government what they intend doing about those sections of the bill. Would they bring forward more legislation to address those? That's a bit up in the air at the moment. So I think unless we get this resolved in the House of Lords, then we're probably heading for the courts, and that's deeply regrettable.
Under what circumstances would your party be arguing for the Scottish Government to grant legislative consent for leaving leaving Europe?
Well, we want to see a deal. We want to see a deal. I mean, it's really frustrating that we have this political standoff, and I think in some ways the Parliament's been used as a bit of a pawn in that we have the UK government and the Scottish government in a standoff. Labour being very pragmatic in trying to bring a solution to this through the House, through amendments in the House of Commons, and that standoff is still there. So I do hope we get a deal, and that we can come to a conclusion that is in everyone's interest.
And what do you think of the behaviour of the Tory party in terms of its bid to block this bill?
I never think much of the behaviour of the Tory party, I have to say.
In terms of its argument, the Tory party's MPs, Scottish MPs, are now threatening to derail Brexit because of the fisheries deal, but yet they don't seem to believe that the devolution principle is as important as that. Is that a strange position for them to have?
I mean, nothing would surprise me about the way in which they behave. They have been absolutely rumbled in the fishing on the fishing issue, and we have a situation where they gave promises only a week or so ago on fishing rights, and they've been well and truly found out. That would be I think that's deeply embarrassing for Ruth Davidson, and for some of those MPs who were elected on the basis of we will ensure that fishing is brought back ASAP, and that's not going to happen. I have to say, equally, I think the Scottish Government's in a pretty difficult position on fishing, because the SNP's position is that they want to rejoin the European Union, which comes with the common fisheries policy. Now, my view is what people need during this process is a bit of honesty, and it was always going to be very unlikely that there would be a transition arrangement without fishing still being in the common fisheries policy. That was always a very unlikely scenario, and yet the fishermen were told that that would be the case. I think they were led up the garden path, and fishermen are very shrewd people, and I don't think they will forget that.
In terms of suggestions that Scotland could remain within the single market, and there's a suggestion that Northern Ireland could do that, and indeed that there might be some special deal for the City of London. Do you think that Scotland should be aiming to cut that deal?
Well, I mean, the reality is you can't be in the existing single market if you're out with the European Union. That's simply fact. So when the Brexit comes, the treaties end, and you have to renegotiate something else. So there has to be a new arrangement. We want access to that single market. I was speaking yesterday at the Scottish Whisky Association, and they were very encouraged by Labour's position, for example, in the Customs Union, and we had a very positive discussion with myself and Keir Stammer yesterday with the Scottish Whisky Association, hearing directly from a major player in our economy about the advantages of being in that customs union. So we have to renegotiate in terms of the single market and access to the single market, and that would be very much what Labour is pushing.
Have you had much contact with your colleagues in Wales who are, I suppose, speaking with the same voice as the Scottish Government on it?
Yeah, I have. We speak regularly to our colleagues in Wales, and we have done through the process of the Continuity Bill, and we meet them regularly. And I mean, there's whilst the Scottish and Welsh governments have worked very closely on the Continuity Bill, I do think they're working on this for different reasons. I mean, the Government of Wales is absolutely committed to ensure that devolution works. The SNP ultimately want devolution to fail because they want to move on to independence. So whilst there's a coalescing around the Continuity Bill, I think there are different, there's certainly nuances within the motives for going down that line.
Have you been surprised, though, how hard the Scottish Government seems to be working to get some agreement? Because a lot of people, even in the independence movement, would regard that as a bit of a waste of effort.
I don't think it is a wasted effort. I mean, these are hugely important issues for the future of the country, and actually, I have my concerns about some of the tactics and the motives, but I think ultimately, I think Mike Ruskell and I have form. I think he has played this pretty straight with us, and I don't give Mike credit, and he would never give me credit very often. But we've worked together on a number of areas in this, and he has done across the parties. So I would give him credit for that.
One final question then. One of the fears that you expressed at the very beginning of this process was that there wouldn't quite be enough time to give this due consideration. Do you think those fears have been justified, or do you think it's been fairly reasonable?
I do have those nagging concerns, and I think that's shared across the Parliament. I think even government members, in a quiet moment, they would never say this publicly because they never say anything contradictory publicly. But I think they would have concerns about the rushed nature of this. This is not the way we should do legislation. Legislation is far better when it's been considered. I think the main concern for me is about the engagement with external organisations who have a real stake in this, and they have had very limited time. I mean, bear in mind, a lot of organisations have got very limited capacity, therefore dealing with a complex bill and all the amendments to that, it puts a real strain on organisations who've got an interest in this, but have found it very time limited in the way in which they can contribute to that. So it's not people can judge for themselves. I don't make a party political point in that. I make a parliamentary point in that it is not really the way we should do things. It's always better to have much longer, more inclusive consideration of legislation, and that way you get better legislation.
Thank you very much for your time. Okay, thanks a lot. Cheers. Mike Ruskell, you're the Scottish Government Minister for all things Brexit. Where do you expect to be at the end of today?
Well, I hope that the Scottish Parliament will have passed the Continuity Bill, that is the bill that creates the circumstances in which Scotland can control what happens over the next year to 2 years in the Brexit process. If we are in the position to have that, then we have a bill available should we choose not to give legislative consent to the UK bill. And that's, of course, the dispute we've been having, because we haven't given legislative consent to the UK withdrawal bill. We can't do it in the present circumstances. So this creates the circumstances in which we could move forward, regrettably, in the Brexit process, because I don't want to leave the EU. I absolutely don't want to leave. But if that happens, then we take control of some of the important levers, not all of them, but some of the important levers in terms of what happens legislatively, so that there is no cliff edge, so that Scottish businesses and individuals in Scotland don't face impossible circumstances, whether it be in the end of March 2019 or the end of December 2020.
What is the move by the Westminster Government which would allow you to grant legislative consent?
It is merely to recognise the reality of the devolved settlement, which you would think they would want to do, and recognise that consent is required from the Parliament of Scotland, from the Assembly in Wales, if there is to be the establishment of joint frameworks which involve any powers that either Scotland or Wales have. This is absolutely no more than the present constitutional settlement requires. There is a procedure so to do. All they have to do is to recognise the reality of being in 2018 instead of thinking that they are in 1974.
Westminster Government has moved on this already. There are now, I think, there were initially 110 powers, now there's down to 24. Does that not show some willingness on their part to compromise?
Well, they've changed their approach, and for that I'm grateful, but it doesn't solve the central question. The central question is whether there's 1 or 111 powers. The central question is consent regarding those powers. The number of powers relates to the areas in which the UK government think European competences and Scottish competences intersect. In other words, things that this Parliament controls, which are presently also part of the European settlement. Now, in those circumstances, that list of 111, and there have been all sorts of lists, the UK keeps reissuing lists, quite often without telling us, which isn't very helpful. But however many there are, essentially there's a whole range of things in that list which shouldn't bother anybody, because the UK has no interest in them. Presently, it could choose to take an interest. That's one of the worrying things in it. It could suddenly say, no, we are interested in that, and in the present circumstance we couldn't do anything about it. But there are things that are of no concern to them presently. There's also a list of things which don't need legislation. There are already arrangements that take place to administer those things. And the 24 or 25, depending how you define it, things that you're referring to, things that are likely to need legislation in order to be able to work together. For example, agricultural support. That's presently done in a European context. The law and the regulations for that constantly refer to the Council of Ministers, the Common Agricultural Policies. You have to change all those things. So if we're going to do it, and we need to do it together, then we need to recognise each other's powers and our powers to alter it as we see fit. And that's the difficult, contentious area. Now, we could reach agreement on all of those, providing there is an acceptance that the right to do so lies with all of us. It doesn't just lie with the United Kingdom government, it doesn't just lie at Westminster, it lies with all of us, because all of us have a stake in this, because all of us have legislative responsibility. Now, this isn't just about the arcane nature of law or parliaments or politics. It's about the practical application of important things. And an example does lie in farming. The farming subsidy support in Scotland is different from that supplies in England. For example, in my constituency in Argyll and Bute, every farmer gets something called a less favoured area payment. That's money that compensates them for the difficulty of farming in circumstances in the west of Scotland, in snow or ice or rain or wind, and with bad hill ground. Now, that isn't paid in England because they don't have the same problems. So we have a different approach. And that would mean that we could apply that different approach. The decisions on whether a farmer in Benderloch gets his payments shouldn't be made in Basildon. It should be made in Edinburgh and in Argyll. And as a representative of Argyll, I should be part of that decision-making process. So what we've got to do is recognise how devolution works, accept that, accept the principle, and then we can work on the detail. And one of the problems with the UK government at the moment is it spends all its time looking at the detail and it doesn't think about the principle. So all the way in which we had this negotiation is about trying to second-guess the devolved administrations instead of working out between us the principles that we should apply.
'em. And those principles, I guess, are devolution is a settlement, and therefore that should be protected. In what way is this undermining that, really? Because I mean, you could argue that, as they do, there's a framework under which some of these decisions and some of this legislation needs to be placed. What's the problem with that?
At the heart of the devolved settlement is a very clear understanding. You have items that are reserved and items that are devolved. Schedule 5 of the Scotland Act says these are the things that are reserved. Everything else is devolved. Now that's how we've worked. That's how we've worked since the late 1990s. That's the basis of the Constitution under which we live. Now, many people like me and you and people watching this channel, I hope lots of them, believe that we should go much further than that and that Scotland should be an independent, sovereign nation, pooling its sovereignty. But there's a concept actually here of pooling sovereignty, pooling our responsibilities in order to be able to work together. But pooling only takes place if there's a recognition of your rights. If it's not pooling, it's theft.
While you hope to reach some compromise agreement with them, with Westminster, supposing that's not possible, supposing you don't give legislative consent, the next stage is the Supreme Court, is that correct?
Not necessarily. I don't think anybody really wants to be going to court if they can possibly avoid it. We brought the Continuity Bill in, and Wales has brought in that Continuity Bill, because we recognise it may not be possible to get agreement. We've waited as long as we possibly could to do this. That's why this has been emergency legislation. But we have to get that through before royal assent to the UK bill if our bills are to have effect. So eventually we decided we had no alternative to do this. And what we're putting in place is the belt and braces structure. If we can't get agreement with the UK, then by refusing legislative consent, we would have nothing to go in its place. So we're putting in place a piece of legislation that allows the process to continue. And what that legislation does, and it's carefully drafted and carefully put together, is it matches the UK bill. The UK bill deals with matters that are reserved and international matters, and the Scottish bill deals with domestic matters, it deals with devolved matters. And we think those bills are perfectly complementary. It's been through an intense process of scrutiny in the Scottish Parliament. There were a lot of complaints at the start of the process that there wasn't enough time for scrutiny. We've had 11 hours of stage 2 scrutiny, line by line. This bill has broken all sorts of records in this place. And we've done it with everybody because we wanted everybody involved. And the bill has changed. The bill's got better as a result of positive amendment, usually from Labour and the Liberals and the Greens who've brought positive amendments. There are even some amendments we've taken from the Conservatives. A lot of their amendments, I'm afraid, were designed to wreck the bill. But those amendments that we thought were useful, we've taken. So we've got a better bill. We hope the Parliament will have passed that bill by the time people are watching this. We hope that will have been through. And then we've got a situation where we could move forward, even without the UK bill. What that would mean is that the UK would be required, if we don't give legislative consent, Convention would require the UK to withdraw those bits of their bill that we haven't consented to, and then the two bills could work together. That might be a good model for how these things should go forward. So I don't think this is confrontational. I think this is sensible preparation, and I hope the Scottish Parliament will accept my view on that.
Although you've referred, I think, to this being a constitutional crisis, or at least having the potential to be a constitutional crisis, and that could lead to the Supreme Court. And therefore, what options are open to the Supreme Court?
Well, I think we've been in a constitutional crisis since the June 2016 referendum, because Scotland voted to stay, and the UK is trying to drag us out. I think that crisis has simply got worse and worse, and it has the potential to get even worse. And what I'm trying to do is to de-escalate it by having arrangements to go forward. But once the bill, if the bill has passed the Scottish Parliament, there is a month of what you might call, in the Western Scottish term, lying time. And that lying time means that bill can be challenged before it gets royal assent by either the law officer in Scotland, the Lord Advocate. He's not going to challenge it. He's stood four square behind his advice to the Scottish Government on this, or by UK law officers, either the Advocate General or the Attorney General. Now that's up to them. We believe, and it can be challenged on the basis of competence. Were we entitled to pass this bill? And of course that's been a dispute.
Because the presiding officer says you're not.
In this building, with his office just 2 floors above me here, the presiding officer said that he didn't think the bill was competent. For the first time ever, and the Scotland Act allows for this. We haven't been operating, I think Adam Tomkin accused us of operating illegally. I think during the stage 2 process, one of the Tory MSPs said there was a whiff of anarchy and lawlessness about this bill, which I have to say, I've never thought of myself as being anarchic and lawless, but you know, it's perfectly legal what we've done. We said no, we disagree. And the Lord Advocate said, and was entitled to say publicly, he thought the advice he'd given to the Scottish Government this was correct. So the bill will be through its process, we hope, by the end of today. It is then up to the UK to challenge it. And then there would be, presumably, a Supreme Court hearing. What happens then is very interesting, because the House of Lords might look at it, I don't know whether it will, but might look at the situation and say, hang on a minute, let's just stop this process of getting the withdrawal bill through until we know what is happening here. So this could gum up the whole works. It might not. If we got to the stage where the Supreme Court didn't have an expedited hearing and the UK passed their bill, then they would be showing contempt for our process, and I hope they wouldn't do that. So I hope the UK would wait and would say, well, let's see what happens here. Now, if the bill was found to be competent, then I hope the UK government would recognise that. Of course, if it were found not to be, it wouldn't be law, because the Scotland Act allows for that too. It's not that anything we're doing is illegal, but there is a process, and if you get to the end of that process and the Supreme Court said, no, this wasn't competent, you have to withdraw the bits that aren't competent, and those cannot be law. And that's the terms of the Scotland Act. So, but that's up to the UK. There's no need to do that. We believe it's perfectly competent. In those circumstances, allow the bill to move forward, but we've put a self-destruct button in the bill, because we have had the discussions with the UK government, and if those were to succeed, we could not proceed with this bill. And there's a clause in this bill that allows us to do that, to stop the process there and then. So we think we're in a firm position. We don't want to do this. We've never wanted to do it. But it's absolutely right in terms of protecting Scotland, protecting Scotland's parliaments and protecting Scotland's interests, which is the job of the Scottish Government, that we do this. And I hope at the end of the day we'll have done it and done it well.
How seriously do you take threats from the Scottish Tory MSPs and MPs to derail the whole Brexit process because of their dissatisfaction with the fisheries arrangement?
Well, I think it's quite intriguing to see people like Douglas Ross and Douglas Thompson, who couldn't get out of this place quickly enough to go to Westminster, suddenly waking up to the reality of their position at Westminster. You know, the fact that a UK government, any UK government, sees Scotland in one of two ways. It's either its assets to be exploited or its voice to be ignored. I mean, that's the split. And I think that, you know, for a bit of time, Ross Thompson and Douglas Ross got a bit above themselves in that term. They thought that they were masters of the universe. They're not being listened to. But it's worse than that, because you could understand that and you'd feel a wee bit sorry for them in those circumstances. But if you stamp around the country saying, for example, as Ruth Davison and Michael Gove said just last week, saying categorically, we will leave the CFP on the 29th of March 2019. No ifs, no buts. We will leave. I heard Ian Duncan say it at a conference, and also about the Common Agricultural Policy some months ago. And that is not true. And they knew it was not true. Because I've known since last year that the negotiations in Brussels were going to insist upon this. I've talked about it publicly. I've asked UK ministers about it, and they've confirmed it to me. So if you tell people that something isn't true, it doesn't matter how upset you get. What people should be saying is, why did you lie to me? Why did you tell me something that wasn't true? Was it just to get my vote? Because that's the worst type of politics, and that brings politics into disrepute.
Talking about red lines and red line issues, we've seen suggestions of a special deal for Northern Ireland. We've seen suggestions of a special deal for the City of London. What kind of Brexit is just beyond the pale for you, or is it an essential part of the Brexit deal that Scotland, for instance, continues to have access to the single market?
It's not so much access. Anybody can have access to the single market. You know, North Korea gets access to the single market. I don't want us to leave the EU. I mean, and the more anybody sees this process, the more they realise how ill-begotten it is, how it's a black hole. It's sucking in energy and money and time and effort, and it's immensely divisive for no purpose. So I don't want that to happen. But in circumstances that it did happen, and given the constitutional setup, that's a distinct possibility, then the only step that I think you could take without major damage would be continued membership of the customs union and the single market. We argued that very strongly in a paper called Scotland's Place in Europe in December 2016. It was allegedly considered seriously by the UK government, but we were told pretty quickly that it couldn't happen. It was unrealistic. There couldn't be a differentiated solution for one part of the UK. We continued to argue it last year, and more people moved in that position. We see the Labour Party moving towards it on the customs union, and still an active debate in Labour and the single market. We've seen the position of other parties and lots of other people moving in that direction. We republished a developed paper this January that looked at it in even more detail, came to the same conclusion, looked at the outcomes of single market customs union a trade deal and hard Brexit. The UK's own figures indicated, we now know, the UK government's own figures, that it was only single market and customs union membership that would mitigate the damage. There will still be damage, mitigate the damage. So I'm absolutely clear. That's what is needed. I don't want to leave. I'd rather stay. If we can find a way to stay, great. But in these circumstances, single market and customs union membership, that is essentially EEA membership, is the only acceptable alternative. It is also up for grabs. The UK could have that. And it would make lots of things simpler, including the negotiations. The Northern Irish situation would be resolved as a result of that. All those things are possible, and that's what we'll continue to argue for. But also continue to say the whole process of Brexit is madness.
Talking about the Labour Party, you've had support from the Labour Party on the continuity bill and on the principle of devolution, less so on the issue of single market. Are you aware of anything that might change the view of the MSPs on that?
Well, I continue to want to have constructive dialogue in this Parliament on this. I mean, I think Brexit is a national emergency, essentially, for Scotland. And I think that we should endeavour to have, as much as we can have, a national response. I'm disappointed in the Conservatives. There was a period last year where they were working with the Scottish Government on the issue of the withdrawal bill. That was a positive thing. There was a voice coming out that said this is unacceptable. They've departed from that now, and now they've taken a very extreme position. Indeed, their attempt to amend the continuity bill today, their wrecking amendment, if that is Ruth Davidson's manifesto to be First Minister, then what she wants to be is a First Minister that does not allow Scotland to deviate a jot or a tittle from what happens in the rest of the UK. That's what she is promising to deliver, because that's what the Tories want to happen. No freedom for the Scottish Parliament to do anything other than observe exactly what happens in London. So, as far as we're concerned, I hope they will return from that position back to a much more honest position of representing Scottish interests. If we can continue to work with Labour and the Greens and the Liberals on these issues, we will do so. But it's on the basis of defending Scotland's interests. Now, I've been able to work so far well and productively with my colleague in the Welsh Government. He's a Labour minister. We recognise very honestly that we have different positions on the Constitution. I want to go on a longer journey to what I think is a much better destination. But we recognise that part of that journey we can make together in terms of defending what we have and the institutions we have, and that's the basis on which we'd work here. I'd hope to persuade Labour that if you're for single market and customs union membership, then that's the best thing you could possibly do in Scotland, and I'll go on trying.
In terms of the Labour Party's relationship with the SNP, it's been tribal, it's often been toxic. Does this agreement on, I guess, protecting devolution, does that offer hope for a different type of relationship in future, or are you still...
Politics is pretty tribal, unfortunately. And we've all been guilty of that. I take my share of guilt of that. I've not been averse to a bit of yabooery from time to time. But I say, this is, in my view, Brexit sits on its own as an issue of such damage to Scotland, such importance to Scotland's future, that if we could find a way beyond the tribal, we should try and do so. Now, that won't be consistent. There will be relapses into all sorts of things. But I'm hopeful that a positive attitude could produce a result. We'll have to wait and see. Maybe not. Scotland has on many occasions in the past said we must raise our game and look up and try and do this a bit better, and then we get a bit sucked back into the past. Let's try and do that. Let's see if we possibly can. And there's a parallel in here, of course, into the wider independence movement too. If at some stage, and I'm not going to start a debate about when it was, but if, as I'm sure will happen at some stage, people are asked for their opinion on Scottish independence again, the people we need to persuade are the people who didn't vote for it last time. And we don't necessarily make that work by saying to those people, well, you were so utterly wrong and so utterly stupid that we can't have anything to do with you. What we have to do is to understand where they're coming from and to try and demonstrate why we think this is a good idea and to have constructive dialogue. And that's what we need to do. I had a ball during the 2014 referendum because I made a decision early on that in addition to everything I did nationally, I would do as many local meetings as I could in Argyll and Bute, village halls in Argyll and Bute. I think we did 70-something of them. I've still got a wee record of them. And at all of them, the effort was to say to people, look, come to this and ask questions. Come to this if you don't agree, and let's see if we can persuade you to agree. And that's what we need to do on a national basis. We need to have that rational approach. This is the country of the Enlightenment. Over my shoulder here, I presume people can see, is Arthur Seton Salisbury Crags, the home of world geology. This is the city, in that description, this is a city of the mind. And we have to have that Enlightenment view of how we persuade people by rational debate, rather than just say to people, well, you're wrong, and we knew you were always wrong, so that's it.
What are the arguments that you are finding the public find most engaging about the Brexit debate? Because it's been a long debate, it's sometimes quite, as you say, quite arcane, although there are higher principles involved. What are I suppose what I'm looking for is what are the triggers that get them interested, and what would be the triggers that would make them want a referendum to defend the principle of devolution, or what would that be?
Well, I don't think we're at that stage of the referendum, at this moment in time. But where we are is bringing home to people the reality of this. When people feel themselves personally engaged in this, people live in a very uncertain world. We all live in an uncertain world. You can't look at the newspapers. You can't look at watch the television and not realise how this world is a very, very uncertain place now. And there's real fears in that world of what will happen next. And then we have to bring to people two things. One is a recognition of how Brexit affects their daily lives, and it will affect everybody's daily lives, both on the basic level of prosperity. Membership of the EU has bought peace and prosperity for half a century. That's what it's guaranteed, that's what it's underpinned. That's now at risk, and it's foolish to put that at risk. But also on the level of what they do, where they work. If you work in almost any sector in Scotland, you're going to notice something different, something not working. If you look at the hospitality sector, there's going to be a substantial shortage of staff. There will be this year, there will be next year. The health service, there are staffing issues. Almost every sector you look at, there are problems for Scotland. And bringing that home to people, but also saying to people there are solutions. And it's not, Brexit isn't a solution. There's no such thing as a good Brexit. There's no such thing as saying we can make this work for us. That's nonsense. That's Tory nonsense. But there are ways in which we can say it crystallises the choices we have to make, the choices we have to make as a nation of what we want for our own future. Are we a small, progressive, intelligent, hard-working nation that's part of Europe, or are we an appendage to another nation that seems to have become very inward-looking? In Chesterton's town, the plain people of England haven't spoken yet. I don't believe that England particularly is as portrayed by Nigel Farage or Rees-Mogg or anybody else like that. But I do think we have to say to ourselves, what do we want to be? We're no more special than anybody else, but what do we want for ourselves? And if that is the question, then we need to look at Brexit and say, how do we take those difficulties and translate them into something else? And we see it through the prism of our own lives, the way our lives have changed.
What is it about Europe, particularly for you, that makes it worth all this work, all this controversy, all this debate, and all this poring over detail?
It's not perfect. Membership of the EU is not perfect. And there are probably other institutions that, at some stage we could have been members of. But after 50 years, you have to accept, whether you like it or not, that we have had a peaceful period on the continent, unrivaled in Europe, certainly in recent centuries, and we've had prosperity. The UK joined the EU in early 1970s after two failed attempts. De Gaulle turned the UK down twice because he did not think, in his own words, that England was European enough. Something that turns out to be absolutely true. But the third time, the acceptance came, and we needed to join for financial reasons. We were an economic basket case. If you think back to the 70s, the 3-day week and the miners' strikes and the electricity going off, this was a real set of problems. And we've had substantial prosperity. It's not a straight line. We've had substantial prosperity. So that's one thing. Another one is, with peace and prosperity together, then perhaps we're learning a better way of working together. And that is as sovereign states. All the states are sovereign. Nobody's given up their sovereignty. But they pool bits of that sovereignty in order to get mutual advantage. That's not the UK pooling and sharing, where you don't get your sovereignty. You have your sovereignty taken away, and in actual fact, in most things, you're just told what to do. In the EU, you have a gathering of equals who work together. There was a time in the EU they used to call it about the tyranny of the tiny. The small nations got a lot more than they might have had because they were doing that. So it's also an exemplar of, with all its difficulties, of how you can work well together and how you can create a circumstance where people can develop and grow and be assisted in that. Look at the Highlands and Islands of Scotland. Really good example. It's had Objective 1 status, which Winnie Ewing got, which was a status that they gave in Europe to areas that were underdeveloped. So there was a recognition, the UK didn't recognise that, it was the EU recognised that, special resources, special help to allow it to develop. And then you saw a big development infrastructure, which came from European funding. Now, the extreme records here say that's not European funding, it's UK funding. Well, the UK never bothered to spend that money. If that was UK funding, why didn't they bring it, to the north of Scotland? They never thought of bringing it to the north of Scotland. So you had ways of working together, recognition of common problems, but sovereignty. The ability to do your own thing, and the ability to choose to do your own thing. And that's what Scotland could gain and should gain as an independent member.
In the event, the bill was passed by 95 votes to 32. It was supported by every political party at Holyrood, with the exception of the Conservatives. There were no abstentions. The big question now is, what happens next?